so I've got y equals 2x minus 3. Okay, so I've got that b value. So again, remember, for step 1 is to find the period. Period is 2 pi divided by b. And b is 2 in this case, so I get 2 pi divided by 2, which equals pi. Okay, so now it's only going to take pi units to get all the way around the graph. So that's my period. Okay, so again, what am I going to do? I'm going to come back over here. I'm going to go 4 tick marks. 1, 2, 3, 4. And now I'm going to call this pi. Okay? So graphs are going to almost look the same. It's just we're choosing to kind of make our own tick marks. It's a little bit easier than having kind of a uniform graph. Now, what are the rest of the tick marks worth? Well, halfway between 0 and pi is pi over 2. Halfway between pi over 2 and 0 is pi over 4. So each one must be worth pi over 4. So this is 1 pi over 4, this is 2 pi over 4, this is 3 pi over 4, and the last one would be 4 pi over 4, but that simplifies to pi. So again, what did I do? I took my period and went out 4 tick marks. I'm going to go to the left as well. So this would be negative pi, negative 3 pi over 4, negative pi over 2, and negative pi over 4. Alright, so there's kind of my starting spot. Alright, next, what do I want to think about? Let's think about that range. Okay, the range, well, here's the midline, so negative 3, and the amplitude is 1. Okay, so I haven't really changed the amplitude, but it's going to be at negative 3, and I'm going to go up 1 and down 1 from that. So the lowest is going to be down to negative 4, and then highest it's going to get is to negative 2. So 1, 2, 3, 4, perfect. Okay, so my midline, so that's negative 1, negative 2, negative 3, and negative 4. So my midline was at negative 3. That's where the middle of my graph is going to be. The highest it gets up to is negative 2. Again, you don't need to dash these in. It just kind of helps sometimes knowing that these are kind of the 3 spots I'm going to make all my key points at. Alright. Lastly, we come back and we got to identify that it's a cosine graph. Remember, cosine starts at a max. So this graph is going to start at its highest point, and there is no horizontal shift. So I'm going to start this graph right at a max. Okay. So, maximum. Now again, maximum, my range was at negative 2. That's the highest this graph goes. So the cosine graph is going to start right there at a maximum. And then the next tick mark, it has to get to the minimum, or to the midline, which is at negative 3. Next tick mark, it goes to the next key spot, which is a minimum. Then next tick mark, it's back to the midline. Next tick mark up at a max. So again, there's one full cycle. Max to a max. Keep going every 2 little boxes. And let's go the other direction. At negative pi over 4, I'm back to the midline. Negative pi over 2 at the minimum. Next key tick mark. So again, the idea is that every one of these key tick marks, the graph should be switching from like a max to a midline, then to a minimum, to a midline, to a max. Always obviously going back to that midline every time you hit a, from a minimum and on. So there's your graph of that one. Okay, so no horizontal shift, but it was a cosine graph. It got scrunched in, okay? So we had to change that period out to pi. Alright, one last one. Okay, we got a pretty complex one here. Again, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to find our period. So our period is 2 pi divided by b, and b in this case is 1/2. Remember, dividing by a fraction is the same as multiplying by the reciprocal, so this is 4 pi. So this graph is going to actually get stretched out, so it's going to be a pretty wide graph. Okay? in 2 pi, I'm only going to get like half of the graph drawn. So it's going to take me 4 pi to get the whole cycle drawn. All right, let's come back and let's take care of that then. So again, I'm going to go out 4 tick marks. Let's be consistent. 1, 2, 3, 4, and we're going to call that 4 pi. So then halfway would be half of that, which is 2 pi, and then 1 pi and 3 pi. Go on the other side and do my negatives. So 4 units out is negative 4 pi, negative 2 pi, negative pi, and negative 3 pi. Alright, let's figure out what else we need. Alright, so now we're going to figure out our range again. So our midline is up at 2. Our amplitude, well, it's like a negative 1. Now, amplitude is really just an absolute value, so amplitude is 1. But we're going to talk about what this negative does in a minute. All right, so that means we're going to be at 2, and from 2, we're going to go up 1, which is going to get us to 3, and from 2, we're going to go down 1, which is going to get us to 1. So my graph should run from 1 to 3. Right, so there's 1, there's 2, there's 3. So again, I'm thinking about the graph looking something like this. So that it's running between 1 and 3 there. Alright. Alright, now we got that last piece to figure out what's going on. It's a sine graph. So remember, sine starts at the midline. And then we'll do that horizontal shift last, I think. And kind of play that off like we did last time. Alright, so sine starts at a midline. Now normally, if here's my midline, I've got my sine graph. The graph goes up and then comes back down. But this negative out in front here reflects the graph. So it's going to start at the midline, but the graph's going to go down first. Okay, so that's a key piece I need to keep in mind. Alright, so what did we say? We said it's sine, so it's going to start at the midline. When I talk about starting, I'm talking about on the y-axis. So it's going to start at the midline. And the next tick mark, it was supposed to go up, but since there was a negative sign, it's reflected, so it goes down. So instead of going to a max, the sine graph actually goes to a minimum. And then back to the midline, next tick mark up at a max, and then midline. And this one would have had to been a max, midline, minimum, midline. Okay. Now this is a graph without this horizontal shift, so I got to take this into account now. So it's plus pi over 2, so I want to go to the left pi over 2. All right, so I'm going to take every point, and let's get a new color in here. Let's do maybe orange. I'm going to go left pi over 2. Well, pi over 2, again, let's figure this out. Every 2 boxes is pi. So pi over 2 would be one of the boxes. Okay, so I'm going to go left 1 box for every single point. So the point is going 1 box to the left. Now again, you could have done this a little bit differently by just starting. I'll talk about that in just 1 second. Alright, so there's the graph I'm looking for, is that orange one. Okay, so your other idea you could have done with this is, since you knew it was a sine graph, and you knew it was reflected, and you know it starts at the midline, but the midline really got shifted to the left pi over 2. So I could have started my graph right here at, left pi over 2. I just think sometimes that becomes a little bit more difficult, because then you're kind of guessing where that next point is. So I think maybe if you do that horizontal shift last, you'd be kind of better off. So figure out the period, make that your 4th tick mark. Second thing, figure out your range. So start with the midline, which is the D value, and then go up your amplitude and down your amplitude. Again, I would kind of suggest you don't have to, maybe even if you're just kind of highlighting the 3 spots on your y-axis, so you kind of know, all those are the 3 spots that I'm looking for, my midline, my max, and my minimum. That's going to give you kind of that range, and it's going to find those key points for you. Then determine if it's sine or cosine. Again, sine graph's going to start at the midline. Cosine graph's going to start at a max, unless they're reflected. If a cosine is reflected, it actually starts at the minimum. Good thing to know. So reflected cosine starts at the minimum. A reflected sine just goes down first versus going up. So those are the differences with that. Okay. So again, lots of stuff to put into play there, but hopefully you can figure out how to graph sine and cosines with transformations now.